Catherine Michaud Leclerc is Assistant Professor of Economics at Université de Laval in Canada. She's a microeconomist with research interests in the economics of education and development economics. Her research focuses on education systems in the context of Pakistan, Malawi, Latin America, and Canada. Topics covered in her work include interactions of public and private education, the use of technology as a study tool, and college students' achievements. And you have just arrived from a big trip, Tanzania and Malawi. So thank you so much for being here.
So as Sonia just mentioned, I just got back from a 6-week field trip in Malawi and Tanzania. And I thought I should tell you more about this field trip. This is very early stage work, so not very typical economics presentation. But I thought it was very relevant in this discussion that we're having with practitioners and researchers. So I was in Malawi and Tanzania to learn more about early childhood education in East Africa. I've met with a lot of people, and today in my presentation I want to tell you more about what this kind of early stage field work looks like, at least from my perspective as a researcher. And so this is early work on thinking about transforming the lives of children through effective childhood education in Africa. This is joint work with my colleagues Laura Dirksen, Elizabeth Dewey, and Michael Perlman. So let me start by, as you probably know, the early years are very critical for children's development. And there's research showing that those early years have positive impact on cognitive skills, behavior, labor market, and even in the long term. There's quite a bit of work in the context of the US. We know a little bit less in the context of low-income countries. And thinking about interventions in those early years, well, access to preschools is quite an important one. Not only for individuals, because it increases their cognitive skills, education attainment, but also for society and the communities in which these individuals live. And preschool access is expanding very rapidly in low-income countries. And as I mentioned, we don't know very much about its impact. There's more limited research on these questions, especially in the context of East Africa, at least. And in these settings, preschool quality varies quite a lot. And quality of early childhood education might be very important. And to give you an idea of what I have in mind in terms of preschool, variation of preschool quality in these settings, so on the left side, this is in the context of Tanzania, you have this funded preschool of much higher quality where you have pictures on the wall. So I've cropped a little bit, but there are 3 educators in this classroom with about 25 children, with lots of material. Children are learning. It's quite clean. As opposed to here, you have also very typical in Tanzania. This is a picture from Malawi, but very typical preschool, where it's pretty much just a building, nothing on the wall, children sitting on the floor, which is fine sitting on the floor. I visited one preschool where they had chairs and nothing else. What do you do with chairs? Not much, right? But, there's nothing on the wall. You don't see it on that picture, but usually it's about nearly 100 children, 1 or 2 educators, so very high ratios. So this is what I mean in terms of variations of preschool quality and thinking about, is this actually good for children when those one-on-one interactions are so important for children? Would those children be better off staying at home or not? So this is what we have in mind. So the research agenda we want to build has 2 components. So first of all, in contexts where some policymakers and governments are very low resources, they have limited resources, what kind of cost-effective and impactful interventions can they adopt to improve the quality of preschools, but also children's holistic skills? So what we have in mind, play-based learning material, thinking about training, but we have to be careful with training. There is already some research showing that training doesn't have an impact on children's learning. And, we were thinking about these research results and the fact that there are so many children in these classrooms. How can you effectively bring what you've learned in training when there are so many children? And pretty much the best thing to do is just to sing and dance, which we see quite a bit. So thinking about those educator to child ratios is something that we have in mind, bringing more of those one-on-one interactions. And one thing that I'm going to talk about in a moment, in Malawi, educators are completely volunteers. So how can we think about bringing a little bit more motivation in the classroom? So that's the first part of our research agenda. Second part is thinking about these high-quality preschools. What is the long-term impact that they have on individuals and communities? So we are developing partnerships with organizations that have been there for many, many years, and we want to see what is happening to these communities 20 to 30 years later. What can we say about the impact it has on communities? So this is a picture of some of the material that, you have some boxes here with shells or rocks that children use to count, etc. So this is the kind of learning material that we have in mind. All locally made, this is also quite important. So today what I want to do is I want to bring you my researcher's perspective in terms of thinking about developing research projects in preschools and to think about really this quality of early childhood education. So what I did in the past 6 weeks, this is the very early stage, which means that I was there to establish collaborations, partnerships with stakeholders, policymakers, but also local researchers, and that's something I'm going to emphasize in my presentation. So the goal was really to understand well the context, to understand what are the challenges, what has been done in the field, and what are the priorities, not only for government, but really people who are in the field. Also, the goal was to determine who we'll be working with, what organizations we'll be working with in terms of project implementation. The second part for us is to develop a research agenda. And one thing I want to mention, as a researchers, when I meet with all these stakeholders, policymakers, they say, a priority should be training teachers. But as a researcher, I know that training on its own might not make a difference. And we know that from already existing literature. So my researcher's perspective is, yes, I want to bring some interventions that are relevant for the context, but I want to push that research frontier on what we know. How can training may be more effective and things like that. So our goal is to design interventions in the context of Malawi to improve early childhood education and development in a sustainable way. That's a key word in these local settings. And one example is, for example, as I mentioned, educators are volunteers. They don't receive any income. But also in my researcher perspective, it's not clear that if we give money to those volunteer educators, that we'll see any improvement in children's learning. And my goal is not necessarily to write a paper that shows, well, if we start to pay volunteer caregivers, there will be no impact on children's learning. That's not what I want to do. But how can I discuss with people in the field to think about ways to maybe improve children's learning, also educators' experience, in a sustainable way? The second part is in the context of Tanzania. It's more about collecting data on the mapping of different preschools and to try to match this with high quality data. And one thing I want to mention also, and this is quite relevant to the presentations we just had, it's a challenge in itself also to work with organizations and NGOs in the field. They invest a lot of money to do a lot of great things, yet they don't always have the tools to causally study the impact that they have. But maybe they're a little bit scared to do so as well, right? Because they invest so much money. What if suddenly there's a research paper showing, well, what they do does not really help? Following some discussions, there's some organizations, they say, oh, we gave grants, we gave a lot of money, what we do is great, we have reports showing that. And then you talk a little bit more and they say, yeah, there's some schools that became the chief's house in this community. And I'm like, this is great. We want to know what is the optimal amount that maybe we want to give. Because maybe too much money is not the effective way to help the community in itself. So not always easy to convince some organizations to randomize, but because that's how by randomizing these interventions, that's the tools we use to, and you mentioned some of that you've been doing. So now let me tell you a little bit about 5 minutes. I'm going to go quicker. So Malawi here, one of the poorest country in the world. early childhood education is provided through NGOs, the private sector, and CBCCs. What are CBCCs? They're community-based childcare centers. They emerged following the HIV epidemics, where there were a lot of orphans, and the community designed those centers to help the children. As I said, educators completely volunteer, about one caregiver per 50 children. So my work going to Malawi, there's a lot of people I met, local researchers just showing up at the university, looking online, but universities' websites are not always very clear and updated, but trying to find who is working on early childhood education in the field, and people who have published on these topics. Local researchers do struggle sometimes to publish, but they have so much knowledge and expertise. And for us as a team, there's no harm in bringing more local researchers, and there's so much value to bringing them. I realized there was a typo here, but so some of the organizations we met, I'm going to mention ActionAid. ActionAid is a Roger Federer Federation that brings tablets into preschools to help caregivers provide some activities to children. So we hope we'll be working with them after the pilot project that we want to develop. Met with government, who is in charge. It's not the Ministry of Education in charge of early childhood education. These are things you learn while you're in the field. So meeting governments and some of those CBCCs. So what my work here, it's always nicer with pictures. So this is the typical CBCC. So you see nothing on the wall. And here I was with some of the staff who are running the early childhood development programs at the University of Malawi. And they brought us to this CBCC where we were meeting with one educator who was telling us about all the challenges they're facing. And here this is talking with the director of research implementation in the government at the Ministry of Gender, Community Development. So talking about the projects we want to implement. So this is what my field work looks a lot like. So what are the interventions we have in mind? Low-cost training has limited impact. We think that those high ratios make it very challenging for educators to implement the training that they use. So in fact, in those CBCCs, because everyone is a volunteer, there's about 10 volunteers who rotate every day. And just one person spends one day at that CBCC, and the other days they can try to have some businesses. So we're going to try to bring those 10 volunteers every day to increase ratios. How are we going to motivate them to do that? So we'll have some cash payment intervention we're thinking in mind, align with the government's goals, so $20 per month, very little amount. But we're thinking also about, this is community driven, so we're thinking about developing a community business plan where, we can just buy some goats and then the community is there, raise the goats, and then can be a source of income for those educators who will be having more, hopefully, one-on-one interactions with children. So now what's our next steps? We need money, so we're applying for grants to do the piloting and hopefully eventually the full-scale interventions. Yes. So that's the work in Malawi. Second part, moving to Tanzania, slightly richer country. Provision of early childhood education is done by the government, private sector, and madrasas. So we are working with the Madrasa Early Childhood Program in Zanzibar. This is a program that is funded by the Aga Khan Foundation. They have also work in Tanzania mainland, Uganda, as well as Kenya. So we hope this is very long-term plan research agenda for us. But this is the high quality picture I showed you. They have trained, paid educators. Ratios are much larger. So met with a lot of people while I was there. But what we have in mind is to work with this Madrasa Early Childhood Program and obtain data with them, but working in collaboration with them, trying to make it clear that, our goal is to understand better the long-term impact. There's already research showing the short-term impacts of their program. We want to see 20 to 30 years later, what's happening to these communities. So our goal is to map all the preschools. And, also I've worked on the interactions of different types of schools. So that's also something we hope to do. We've met with a lot of local researchers who also want to join the team. And not only economists, people from education department. So we are still in the proposal development. ethics, getting IRB is very important. We want to build a trust relationship with this organization, and we want to do things correctly, which means making sure that all this data sharing is done in a potential ethically way. So this is another picture of this preschool. So in my 30 seconds, understanding the context is key. I want to emphasize again, working with local researchers who know quite a bit. I think there's no cost for us. It's just a value added, but it's not about adding everyone in the team, but we want to involve more local researchers and being mindful about sustainability. If we do this one-year project where we provide cash to educators, in 2 years they won't have cash. Government right now, 60,000 caregivers, only 2,000 are paid out of 60,000. And when you talk with the government, they say, we don't think we can expand to another 2,000 in the next 2 years. So this is not sustainable. So this is our, goats are more likely to be sustainable. And one thing I want to mention, NGOs, local and international organizations, make a clear difference in the field. There's no early childhood education without these organizations in the field, so working with them makes so much sense. So thank you so much. And